Hello again. This week, spurred on by a discovery, which we will get to in a few minutes, we're going to look at gilding, or the substitutes for gold, historic substitutes for gold. Now, the alchemist's quest, if you like. The main one, the main substitute to gold has always been to gild objects, to deposit a thin layer of pure gold over the surface of an object to give it the appearance of solid gold. Things like the Gloucester candlestick in the Victoria and Albert Museum, a perfect example of that. I don't have anything that old. What I do have is an egg spoon, slightly less grandiose than the Gloucester candlestick, I must say. But there's a Regency, sort of 1810, 1820 egg spoon. It's in copper. The whole thing is copper, but it has been mercuric gilt. There have been two historic ways to deposit a layer of gold on the surface of an object. For the most part, up until about 1840, 1845, it was mercuric gilding. You mix together, you form a paste of gold, pure gold and mercury. That's a paste which you can apply to the surface of a copper object, of a metal object. You can fire that, which then drives off the mercury and leaves a pure film, quite a strong bonded film of gold on the surface of the object. It's very hazardous, it's quite expensive, but that was the chosen way to deposit, certainly in Europe, gold on the surface of an object for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Obviously, we also touched in a much earlier video on electrodepletion plating, which is where you have an object which has a quantity of gold in it, together with other base metals, and the object is worked up and then it's immersed in an acid. And basically the acid, if you do it briefly enough, removes all the surface base metals from the outer skin of the object, leaving a pure surface of gold. And then it's that mixture, that low carat mixture, all the way through. You don't really tend to see that in Europe very much at all. And it only, to my knowledge, happened with silver in the debasement of the coinage of Henry VIII, where old copper nose, they used to dip the coins in acid to make them look a bit more silvery. But there were various attempts in the 18th century to make substitute materials that didn't actually contain gold at all. The main one you will all be familiar with is Pinchbeck, because Christopher Pinchbeck, who was a clockmaker in Clerkenwell, at the beginning, well, the end of the 17th, the beginning of the 18th century, he devised a metal which was basically a different ratio of copper and zinc to make brass, but it was a very gold-looking brass. This was used for clock cases, for watches, and latterly, because his family, even after his death in 1732, they continued to produce objects. I've certainly seen wine labels from the 1740s and 50s produced with CP stamped in the back for Christopher Pinchbeck, which must be the son or the grandson as the generations went on. And the reason you'll know the name, even if you've never seen a piece of Pinchbeck or owned a piece of Pinchbeck, is over the period that it was produced, from about 1700 to up to about 1830, it became sort of a common term of abuse for something that was cheaply made, not of gold. Oh, it's Pinchbeck. And yet pieces still turned up and fooled people for years. So that was the first sort of alloy substitute which contained no gold. There are other little tries and techniques throughout the 18th century. Now I'll show you these. These are extraordinary. Bought these many years ago. These are shoe buckles. Yes, of course, they're shoe buckles. What else do I own? And they look ostensibly to be a fantastic pair of gold shoe buckles. And my goodness, I wish they were. I could retire. But if I flip them over to the side that when you were wearing them you'd never see, you'll see there's the sort of dull brown metal, which is actually unpolished brass. And you might think, oh, there, some mercuric gilt shoe buckles as well. These are more interesting in the fact that this gold, when you look at it under an eyeglass, is actually a sheet of gold, a very thin, like tin foil out of the cupboard. It's a foil of gold that has been fused on to a base frame of brass. So this is very much a French plating technique where you're taking a leaf of another metal, quite a substantial leaf. You can see it. It's got quite a thickness to it, and it has been fused on rather like, not dissimilar, but not exactly like the Sheffield plating process. It's a sandwich of two metals. And because it's on a brass base, they've been able to go round it and chase it. So you get all this beautiful decoration. And it is a very buttery yellow. And if we compare it to the mercuric gilding, you could say this is a bit brighter, this is later. But this has more of the feel of what pure gold looked like. It's a very good imitation, and it's the only example of this technique that I've come across. I'm sure there are others. I'm sure it was used for watch cases and cane handles and all sorts of things that people might not be readily aware of because they can't see the back of the object, but very convincing. But the reason why I'm looking at these different techniques is because of something I found recently and which arrived this week. Salutations all the way from Canada. So that was fantastic. We've repatriated something, and it is these, and they're not going to blow your socks off when you see them, but they should. They don't look terribly goldy, do they? They are, again, shoe buckles. If we hold them in the light, maybe the reverse is a little bit less tarnished. There's a faint look of, a very faint look of gold about them. I'm not sure it would convince me. But then once they were immediately out of the workshop and given a bright polish on a machine, maybe it would. But if you put it next to something that's gilt, it looks quite pale. But this is something I'd heard about, but never seen. A bit like Pinchbeck. All manner in the 18th century, all manner of industrialists and inventors were off trying to make their fortune. And one that you probably haven't heard of is Richard Dovey. And Richard Dovey decided, or happened upon in 1773, to register a patent for a metal. And I've written this down so I don't forget it. This is exactly from the patent, for making a metal the colour of and in all respects resembling gold. Well, we won't hold you to the Trade Description Act, Mr. Dovey. Dovey, however you say it. But this is it. And most of these alloys, like Pinchbeck was a form of brass. Brass is copper and zinc. Bronze is copper and tin in various quantities to make different colours. Pinchbeck was mostly copper with a little bit of zinc, whereas standard brass has less copper and more zinc. So it's all about playing about with proportions. Dovey's patent, I'm still not sure how I should say that. Dovey's, let's decide on Dovey. Dovey's patent was again a base metal of copper. This time it comprised both zinc and tin, but the main addition, the thing that made it special, was it also included manganese ore. That was the secret ingredient, if you like, of Dovey's patent. I'll never get my tongue around that. Now, what's interesting, and again I've got this written down so I don't get the dates wrong, that in the London Gazette on the 23rd of March 1774, Richard Dovey of 6 Craven Buildings has a patent for King's Metal. This is what he decided to call it, and why not? It's very good marketing, isn't it? King's Metal, a gold substitute. And the fact that this is the very first object I've seen and this is why I got excited when I saw it, with the words Dovey and patent stamped on it, stamped Dovey patent. Absolutely amazing. The only things I've ever seen anywhere shows you what a tremendous failure it was. And actually, there's a Richard Dovey who is described as a buckle maker of Wolverhampton. So we would have talked like this, mate. Wolverhampton, who was actually in a Stafford jail in 1774 for debts. And it's not sure whether it's the same Richard Dovey or not, but buckle maker, looks like it, and probably in debt because his King's metal didn't go down terribly well. But these are all the different substitutes you get for gold, all of which, I have to say, are blown out of the water in 1840 when Elkington started electroplating stuff. In huge quantities, in large electrolytic baths, one after the other, after the other, after the other. So at that point, all of this became redundant. And certainly for the lower value pieces of jewellery where you couldn't afford 22 or latterly 18 karat gold, which were for a long time the only standards that were allowed to be assayed, lower carats were then permissible to be worked. 15 carat, 12 carat, 9 carat, which is mostly copper after all, 9 carat gold. Only a third of it is actually gold. So once those standards come in, the need for these substitutes goes out of the window, but they are rare, and perversely, he says, because he owns them now, perversely, this pair of buckles made in about 1773, 1774, because I think after that Dovey was bankrupt, these are much, much, much rarer than gold ones. You will find another pair of gold shoe buckles somewhere. I doubt you'll see another pair of Dovey's patent. But there we go. So I'm happy to show you those and take you through a brief gallop through substitutes for gold, antique substitutes of gold in the earlier and 18th centuries. But it's just a delight. And these things, you know, if you'd have asked me if I'd have ever seen a piece of Dovey's patent, I'd say probably none of them exist anymore. But they turn up. They turn up. Where do they turn up? On eBay in Canada a few weeks ago. It is quite amazing. It's all out there. Keep looking, keep hunting, and you'll find it. So until next week, good antiques hunting and goodbye.